one. So I'm going to be talking about the differences, the many differences, and the similarities between Hoppeanism and Marxism. This is Hoppe over here, a libertarian thinker. And this is Marx and Engels, who developed the theory of communism. So some of the parallels that these two ideologies had, both of them opposed feudalism and mercantilism on economic grounds. Marxism saw these periods as essentially pre-capitalist, feudalist periods predicated on the oppression of peasants or serfs. Hoppeanism had a similar view, or has a similar view of both of them as being kind of the period before capitalism that evolved into capitalism. They're both anti-war in principle, though many Marxist regimes in practice were very expansionist or pro-war. There's never been a Hoppian country, so both Marxism and Hoppianism are secular or non-religious. They don't have any religious affiliation, though both have some religious influences. Marxism is influenced notably by the spiritualism of Kant, which bled into Hegel. So they have some spiritual elements there, especially with the ideas of labor and alienated labor. Hoppeanism also borrows a little bit from Kantian ideas, which are necessarily rooted in the beliefs of Ludwig von Mises, or Mises. Both were anti-slavery. Many libertarians, Hoppe included, see slavery as an inefficient and morally bankrupt economic system. Marxists have a similar view of it. They also view it as another category in history that was replaced by feudalism, and then feudalism was replaced by capitalism. They're both ostensibly anti-imperialist, though, like I said, with the anti-war, many Marxist regimes did not really practice what they preached. In terms of this, the Soviet Union held a almost imperial-like control over much of Eastern Europe and East Asia for a time, and Marxist regimes regularly expanded their influence through soft and hard power. Hoppeanism is decentralist, so they oppose imperialism on principle. This is the last major parallel. Both are anti-nationalist. Like I said, Hoppeanism is decentralist in principle, so they advocate for the breakup of larger states, which is the antithesis of nationalism in many regards. Whereas Marxists are actually internationalists, so they support an international world government of the proletariat. So that rejects the idea of ethnic nation states or homogenous entities. So some differences. Marxism viewed that capitalism and its use of private property as a legal institution was inherently oppressing the proletariat because the bourgeoisie owned all of the private property, whereas the proletariat held none of the private property. And thus, Marxism believed that because of this, the bourgeoisie were able to exploit their private property to oppress the lower classes. Hoppe, on the other hand, believed that the state was the main organ of oppression of pretty much all classes. It was called the productive class, so this would include both bourgeoisie and laborer, because in Hoppe's view, the producer, the capitalist, and the laborer work together in contract, so it is a voluntary exchange in nature. Whereas the state is in nature involuntary, because you do not sign a contract with the state, and the state can extract wealth from your property in the form of taxes without consent of the property owners. So that is where the view of the state being the oppressor comes from. On top of this, economically, Marx believed in the labor theory of value, which is essentially the idea of surplus value that is being extolled by the capitalist from the finished product that the laborer has created. And this results in phenomena such as alienated labor in Marxist terminology. And essentially, so say there is $1 of production cost that the capitalist spends and $2 worth of wage labor that a person is doing for the capitalist. Marx argues that reasonably the product should be valued at $3, but because of surplus value and the capitalist needing to make a profit, the actual product is worth more than $3. And he argues that this extra value that is added on, this extra, say, dollar, for example, is surplus value, which in Marxist terms is a form of theft. Now, it is notable to mention that the labor theory of value has been repeatedly discredited by most economics, people in the economics profession. So it's not as credible, and it's kind of an outdated metric. Hoppe believes in the subjective theory of value, which is that the prices of goods are subservient to market demand, and this is one of the arguments also made against the idea of natural monopolies. Another thing that they kind of have a difference on is Marx believed in a completely stateless society eventually that would be achieved through a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's not here, but he also was an advocate of democracy, whereas Hoppe, on the other hand, very firmly despises democracy and instead advocates for decentralized covenant communities that respect freedom of association, which is essentially it rejects both forced integration and forced segregation in favor of voluntary individual participation. This is one thing that gets really controversial with Hoppe, and why a lot of libertarians do not like Hoppe very much, is that Hoppe does support total freedom of association, which means essentially private property owners can do anything they wish with their private property, including excluding other people that they wish from their private property, just on accord of private property rights. And he argues this through argumentation ethics and many other methods used to come to this conclusion that you cannot reject property rights on any basis, even the basis of purported equality before the law. And in terms of class conflict, both of them had different views as well. Like I said, Marx viewed the owners of capital, the capitalist, as the enemy of the proletariat, or the producers of capital, whereas Hoppe believed that the productive class, which is both the producers and the consumers of capital, or the people who make the capital, so the owners of capital and the producers of capital, versus the non-productive class, which would be defined as like the politicians and other people who are on the public payroll and are paid for by public taxes. And this is getting to the idea that taxation is theft, which is kind of a similar view. It's a parallel view to Marx's belief that profit is a form of theft. That Hoppe believes, and many libertarians believe, this isn't just Hoppians, that taxation is illegal and should be considered a form of aggression via the non-aggression principle, the NAP, because there is no contract and taxation is involuntary by definition, which is why there's some arguments saying that if you simply make taxation voluntary, then it's not no longer theft. Whereas some more radical libertarians believe that it should be abolished altogether. And on top of this, their stances on monopolies. I'll go through this quickly. Marx believed that the bourgeoisie held the supreme power in a territorial entity because they owned all of the private property. Hoppe believed that the state is a territorial monopolist that controls the entire country. And this results in state-run industries that monopolize territory away from the productive class and exclude the productive class from certain areas. Marx was obviously a collectivist in ethos. A lot of his ideas were based in ideas of altruism. Hoppe is an individualist by definition. He is from the Austrian school, which practices methodological individualism in their economics. So, and then public property, according to Hoppeanism, should be abolished. Private property, according to Marxism, should be abolished. Some other differences. These are just kind of the ideologies that they inspired. So, Marx inspired like equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. It was derived from egalitarianism, the idea of utopianism, the classless societies that many people envisioned, both religious and non-religious. It was democratic in nature, though not in practice. Definitely socialist, communist, though in Marx's period, socialism and communism meant the same thing. He opposes political economy. Dialectics, he gets dialectics from Hegel, and he uses this to create the theory of dialectical materialism, which is essentially the idea that history is driven by nations and resources, and essentially the struggle for resources, so competition, and that this leads to social revolutions that create class conflicts, and eventually, typically the higher class, the class that controls the property, is the class that wins out. Marx believes that the proletariat will eventually overthrow the bourgeoisie, though. Hoppe, on the other hand, very meritocratic ideology, favors natural elites, so people who are more skilled than others or more physically able than others should have better opportunities. Hoppe does make the distinction between private government ownership, which is, in other words, monarchy or aristocracy, to public government ownership / republicanism or democracy, more commonly democracy. He believes that private government ownership is slightly better simply because the monarch has a more vested financial interest than a democratically elected person who is only there for 4 years. It is libertarian in nature, obviously part of the Austrian school of economics, which is a highly radically libertarian school, capitalist, very pro-secession, opposes public slavery serfdom, so kind of what we saw in practice in the Soviet Union. History is driven by individuals and ideas, which is another common concept philosophically that comes up in libertarian circles. Freedom of movement, this is essentially along the same lines as freedom of association. A big idea is also time preferences, the idea that some cultural ideas have better time preferences than others, and this explains why certain cultures do better than others over time. So it's a very important principle. It's also very important in economics. And of course, free trade, like many other libertarians. So some of the ideological roots. Marxism was rooted in a lot of utopian ideas, utopian socialism. A lot of the revolutions that were, inspired by Marxism were also inspired by the Jacobins, the Sans-Culottes, who Marx kind of saw as like the proletariat. The revolutions of 1848, obviously the Communist Manifesto came out in 1848. Some ideas of anarchism, though I would say anarchism was actually more inspired by Marxism in some ways. Democracy, obviously the idea of like a public government. Georg Hegel was one of Marx's biggest influences. Marx was, as a young man, he was a young Hegelian, and obviously he used Hegel's dialectic method to create the idea of dialectic materialism. He was also inspired by the political economist David Ricardo, who was a socialist, Adam Smith, who was actually the father of capitalism, and Kant, like literally everyone. He's a part of the Austrian School of Economics, and was also inspired by Ludwig von Mises. He was a student of Murray Rothbard, who created the ideology of anarcho-capitalism. Libertarian. A lot of his ideas are very conservative compared to most libertarians, so that's another thing. Laissez-faire economics, so that would also bleed from Adam Smith a little bit, who invented that idea. I wouldn't say so much minarchism. I don't know if that should be on here, but a lot of libertarians support minarchism, which is essentially the idea of a minimal state that has a lot of checks and balances. Anarcho-capitalism, which is obviously from Rothbard. Methodological individualism, which is from the Austrian school, and some liberal ideas as well, like just essentially free trade and capitalism. So yeah.